Paul Evans is professor at University of British Columbia, where Paul has taught since 1999 on Asian and Trans-Pacific affairs. Paul taught at York University from 1981 to 1997. That's 16 years. He was director of the University of Toronto, York University Joint Center for Asia Pacific Studies from 1991 to 1996. And that was when I met Professor Evans. Paul was also visiting professor, Asia Center, Harvard University, 97 to 99. And Paul's been acting director of the Liu Institute for Global Issues, 2004-05 at UBC, and also director of the Institute for Asian Research, 2008-2011. And between 2005-2008, Paul was on leave from UBC to serve as co-CEO and chairman of the Executive Committee of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Right, so both the policy world and the academic world. And Paul's described himself as a regionalist rather than a country specialist, though I think Paul's being very modest in so doing. If I could just add, Professor Evans made very important early contributions to the study of the international political economy of Asian regional cooperation. But also Professor Evans has been a strong advocate for cooperative and human security since 1988, studying Track 2 diplomacy and the construction of multilateral institutions. And among the 8 books authored, edited, that Paul Evans has produced, including most recently Engaging China, Myth, Aspiration, Strategy, and Canadian Policy from Trudeau to Harper. I always remember Paul also for the book that Paul co-edited with Bernie Frolic, Reluctant Adversaries, Canada and the People's Republic of China, 1949 to 1970, which was published in 1991, University of Toronto Press. So very happy to have Professor Paul Evans with us.
Great, thank you, and to Alina and others who have made this surprise a surprise, has brought people together from old friends of Bernie's, people who have come to know him more recently. And Bernie, I want to say at the outset that this is a happier occasion than a wake. And the opportunity to be with someone on their 80th is a very nice occasion when they're there in person. So we're delighted. Around my family, this is not FOB. This is Uncle Bernie. In our family, Uncle Bernie has been with us. We'll get into the academic side in a moment, but in a very special way in our household. And it was partly because of the way he interacted with my children, who have grown up, one of whom has now spent a lot of years in China, perhaps not because of Bernie, but because Bernie was around, but because Bernie liked to talk. Blue Jays and Maple Leafs. And my kids remember when we lived here, Bernie's annual opening remarks before the season started that the season was looking good. But in Bernie's way, it was always with the twist that when, there's a lot of problems. I mean, Frolic is the master of on the one hand and on the other hand. The Leafs are great. They've hired X, Y, and Z on their team, but they have the downside. And speech number 1 at the beginning of the year was always optimistic. They look better in this way, some problems. It was the mid-season speech that the boys remember best, of which tires had fallen off the team in the months to come. And Bernie, you're a legend in our household because of our guys thought you had a really good sense of humor, which you do. And we once asked the question of you, what is more fun, having a baby or a dog? And do you remember your famous answer to this, which is legendary in our family, is that, of course, it's, at least for the first 2 years, it's a dog. And my boys to this day pin that on you as one of the good storytellers. I would love to have met your mother and father and found out what traditions of storytelling you grew up in, because you're a great storyteller. Your greatest story is one of your books, Mao's People, which is a weird academic book based on solid research and all of that, but you're the storyteller. You told, what was it, 8 or 9 stories in there. That is a book that is, if not timeless, is probably one of the few books all of us will read, and maybe our children will read too. You told stories, and my family appreciates it. All of us do. Uncle Bernie has been something very special, special to all of us. And I take him as a bit of an uncle too, because he was one of the people who had such poor judgment to hire me here at York in 1981. And anyone who invests in you at a stage where you probably don't deserve to be doing too much, but you bet on people. You've been very good at betting, taking some long shots. You take predictable shots as well, but you've taken long shots on people. And that uncle. I also think of Bernie in that context as a bit of a mentor. But those of you who know Bernie know that he's also a dementor. And the dementor side of Bernie is that if you ever meet him, and anyone who meets him, I suspect we all have the same pattern. The first thing he does is ask about you. And he's genuinely curious about you or the family or what you're writing, whatever it is. The second thing he often talks about is the wonderful woman that he's married to and her artistic accomplishments. We have heard reports on you, Irene, for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, as your career moved. And he's not totally immodest. I would not go that far with Frolic. But he has his ego under control, and he speaks about other people's contributions before he talks about his own. And that's true. And that's something about you, and this golden mean. I always found that the dementor side of you always celebrated people's accomplishments. That's a nice thing. But you also sort of gave them a kick in the bum when their heads got a little bit too big. And so it was always, your career is going well, but don't you know that someone else is doing better? Or your book's pretty good, but I don't know how it compares to John Fairbank's last book. This kind of thing. And that's a very, very special part. Bernie, for today, we're going to have people who are really great scholars and have worked with you. I want to talk to you about from a slightly different angle, which is you as the Canadian China scholar. In the context of, you weren't born to be a China scholar. You weren't educated to be a China scholar. You weren't trained that way, but you sort of clicked. But I think of you when we all have to wrestle with the dilemmas of what we're doing, what we're trying to accomplish, and what's working, what's not working. You've been Canadian. You spent almost all of your career in Canada. That's not unique. But you have embodied a set of attitudes, an interaction with China that was very much in the mindset of Canadian leaders for a long while. You're an engager. You're a person who looks at China with its good things, its not so good things, the complexity of it. Never do you oversimplify. Never do you singularize. And that was the advantage, I think, of being a Russian specialist before you came to China. But you have, as a scholar, you've been Canadian in a way that some of us like to be, but you've been authentically so through a career. And I want to talk about it in three dimensions very briefly. The first one is you've been a Canadian scholar at a university, in a university context, who has, as we've heard, tried to build China studies and Asian studies. And that effort in many years has not always been easy. Pushing Asia and China, even today, is not an easy exercise. In a department of political science, a great department here, and it's in its heyday, you were a department chair as well. And how you were able to try to make a case for area studies in the context of where methodological, theoretical debates really were grabbing people. You managed to keep area studies alive. You managed to build on it. Still not the highest of grounds in university, but you made an enormous effort that way. And we need that across the country. As a scholar too, you see, you're a Cornell guy. And in my mind, Cornell is signified by someone like Benedict Anderson, a number of the Indonesianists and the Southeast Asianists there. You were educated there, but you were not China-fied there. You did that, my sense is, your keystones, the places you resonate at, if there was one place on earth, it's China itself, but it's Harvard. And your connection with Ezra, with Fairbank, and that kind of tradition of how to think about China which is not always popular in the 21st century. That civilizational perspective, the idea of cultural differences, and how to understand them, bridge them, but not expecting behavior to be the same. I remember Bernie at the time of Tiananmen Square, in which at our university was it hit at hearts. People had different opinions. We tore each other apart with debates. Bernie, you were very similar to John Fairbank at that stage. Fairbank in the sense of understanding something pretty vicious had just happened, but not being deeply surprised by it. You saw it coming weeks before it happened. And that was your combination of realism, but an understanding that in the Chinese political system, things happen in ways that are different and ways we might not like. But nevertheless, that we had to work with people that we don't like. And that has been, that double understanding has been very powerful, and that's a John Fairbanks view. That's a Harvard view as well, in many respects. Harvard's not a single view. You came close to it. Second thing about Bernie is that he was of a generation of China scholars in Canada who had an unusual experience, which was being placed in Beijing as a sinologist in residence. You were part of, Canadians don't go out and in and out of government so often. It's a rare thing. Bernie, you guys did, and some others in this room. Were there any other sinologists in residence? Well, anyway, how many were there? 9 in 13. And I think that impact on you, it kind of made you part of the establishment, even though you're not much of an establishment guy. And you were caught in the midst, your opinions. You worked with people. I was thinking of this morning when putting these remarks together, John Higginbotham. There was this interaction between some of our China specialists inside government and outside government that was a pretty unusual thing. Now, this has been criticized, let's be honest about it, because some of the critics say that what this did was rob China studies in Canada of critical spirits. Instead, they were people who became homogenized into an elite thinking that Bruce Gillies and some others thought was a mistake. However, I think it was something that in a small country that needed expertise and that needed the synapses that allowed us to fund some efforts, move other things on China together, you were caught right in the middle of that. And you used it, you recognized some of the risks it posed, but you went ahead with that. We need you now, Bernie, in another way in that context. My sense is that the consensus in Canada, and particularly within our Global Affairs Canada, about how to address China in the angle that you've championed is falling apart, or at least put it differently, there are significant players inside our government that are taking a line on China that is not quite the engagement line that you have in mind. So we don't have that program anymore. I don't know we need it, but we do need something that you were in and out. And finally, let me talk about Bernie and the public, because scholarship to Bernie was partly about writing books. It's partly about organizing things. It was working with government officials, giving ideas. But it was also about talking to the public. And Bernie and I wrote some op-eds together. He's written several others over the years about how to speak to Canadians about the dilemmas of working with a China that is not always such a nice place, that has exoticism, many attractive elements, but things that sharply contrast with our values and our sense of where the world is. You've wanted to connect to Canadians in that context. I've seen you on media, television, radio, and print, not as much in recent years as at the beginning. But that idea of our audience as China scholars as being something bigger than the academic enterprise or even government, talk to Canadians, that's something you've helped us pioneer. You haven't gone far enough in it, and we need more of you, but it's something that would be great. Finally, John Fairbank wrote 2 books after he turned 80. Now, you see where I'm going to land this, Bernie. In the case of Professor Frolic, we hope there will be many, many writings, many interactions with the press and with all of us, but we need 2 books from you. We need the long-standing magnum opus on the Canada-China relationship, the firm documentary basis that you put together, and I hope with some storytelling in it. that you and I worked on in the 1980s, and it will not be long before your portion of the book is finished. And we're hoping it'll be very, very soon. Get that out. But you got to write another book, Bernie, which is not just for those of us who are academics or in the policy world, but how to explain and live with global China. What do we need to know? You've been on the cusp of this for a long time, and your special role is not over with. Your special role is still needed. We need that second book for the Canadian public. Happy birthday, Professor Frolic. Happy birthday, Uncle Bernie, from all of our family and many who couldn't be here today. With deep appreciation.